Let me introduce our speakers first. And I'm going to go from my left, your right, and you'll see why that is, to my left. Joel Pollak is the Senior Editor-at-Large and in-house counsel at Breitbart News. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, went to work as a research fellow at the Hudson Institute. He actually ran for Congress in 2010, and then befriended Andrew Breitbart, and that got you into Breitbart News. He's the author of several books, including How Trump Won, The Inside Story of a Revolution. More of that to come. And in fact, I think you're selling that book tonight, so it's outside. In the middle is an old friend of mine, Dan Schnur. He's a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications, but as of today, hot off the press, Dan has just been appointed as the executive director of the American Jewish Committee for the Los Angeles area. Congratulations on the new job, Dan. And one of the reasons I wanted him to be here tonight is that Dan was also overseeing the USC Dornsife LA Times Daybreak poll, which was pretty much the only major poll that predicted that Trump was going to win the presidency, unlike most of the other polling, which got it all wrong. So Dan clearly knows something that the rest of us don't know. And closest to me is Josh Lockman, who's a former advisor to presidential candidate Hillary Clinton on foreign policy. And he now teaches international law and US foreign policy at USC Law School. He's a fellow with the Truman National Security Project, and also is an associate at Latham and Watkins in Los Angeles. So welcome to you all, gentlemen. And apart from no hand-to-hand combat, we're going to have a pretty easy format tonight, and I'm sure there will be some disagreements. I would be disappointed if there weren't. We're 103 days in. The United States is still intact. There are still 50 stars on the flag, if you count them closely. The state of our republic is fine. We're going to survive. I'm not sure if there's anyone left whom Donald Trump hasn't attacked in a tweet, or whom
Vladimir Putin,
or whom the New York Times hasn't whined about in an op-ed, or whom Vladimir Putin hasn't tried to hack online. And if there is anyone left off that list, Nancy Pelosi is coming to get them, and she is taking names. But let us start. We are the World Affairs Council, and I thought we might start with not just foreign policy, but probably the major foreign policy challenge that's facing this country today, which is this problem with North Korea, and to what extent we can get China to help us on that. And it's been a major focus of the president. He's had President Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago, where they talked about North Korea. I'd like to get your views, and maybe start with you, Joel. How do you think the president has done in this potentially catastrophic problem that we face? Not of our own making, but it's out there and we have to deal with it.
Well, first of all, good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. It's delightful to have the chance to talk about public affairs in Los Angeles. And I think the president has done spectacularly well, actually, on foreign policy. I think it's been the strongest area of his administration. And I think he has regained, in a very short period of time, the strategic advantage that the United States used to claim automatically. And one of the ways he's done so is by being unpredictable. North Korea is a great example. So a couple of weeks ago, he was tweeting about sending an armada and an aircraft carrier group, wherever it was in the Pacific. Whether it was going the right direction or not, it had a psychological effect, and China began turning the screws on North Korea. Then this week he said, well, he'd be honored to meet with Kim Jong-un, and the media are appalled. How can he say this? Of course, Barack Obama said the same thing when he was running for president in 2007, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Trump is basically offering the North Korean leadership a very clear range of choices, and doing so through the only channel we know of to reach the North Korean regime, which is the media, because there are no direct lines of communication between us and the North Koreans. And he's saying, look, I offer you destruction on one hand, but I also offer you conversation, diplomacy, agreement, maybe a Nobel Peace Prize on the other. It's up to you. You have this range of possibilities. And it's just one way in which Trump, I think, has brought the United States back in full force, both diplomatically and militarily as a world power. So I think he's doing rather well there so far.
Josh, the chances of Kim Jong-un getting the Nobel Peace Prize?
That's definitely not going to happen. But first off, thank you so much, Terry. Great to be with you guys. And congrats, Dan, again, on becoming director of the AJC here in LA. I think that Trump's foreign policy has been, at the very least, erratic, at the worst, disastrous over the first 100 days. So I disagree with Joel. While I'm a huge critic of Trump, I will say that North Korea is a problem that many administrations have failed, both Democrat and Republican alike. But that being said, if you look at the dizzying turns that President Trump has taken, whether it be on North Korea or on Syria, I think it only increases volatility in the respective regions, in East Asia and in the Middle East. And furthermore, I think that with regard to North Korea, it speaks to this almost fetishization of dictators that the president seems to have, where he praises the despot of North Korea, who's obviously executed so many in his country and members of his own family, and in the same day speaks highly of the leader of the Philippines, who's summarily executed many in his own country. And we could go down the list, but I think there is something very problematic there. But I will say, again, this is a problem that predates Trump, it predates Obama. It's going to be a very difficult problem to solve.
Dan, you want to chime in on that?
Sure, and first of all, Terry, like the others, I want to thank you for allowing us to join you here tonight, and want to thank the entire team at the LA World Affairs Council. As I think most of you know, they do tremendous work. They're really a pillar in this community and provide a tremendously valuable resource. So before we go back to the Nobel Peace Prize sweepstakes, let's take a moment to thank not only Terry, but his entire team for the work that they do.
Thank you. Good go. Go team, go team.
I'm going to distill what we've just heard from my two very, very smart colleagues into two adverbs: unpredictable and erratic. What you've just heard there is an almost pure distillation of the dramatic range of viewpoints that Americans hold toward the president. He clearly governs, as he campaigned, in a remarkably unconventional way. And whether you think that's a good or a bad thing is something reflected almost entirely in your choice of adverb. What I'd suggest here, and we can come back to North Korea in a moment, is this is entirely intentional on Donald Trump's part. If you read about his life history before his presidential campaign, you'll see that throughout his career in business, throughout his career in the entertainment industry, his television show, and so on, that Donald Trump not only thrives on being unpredictable or erratic, he believes that he derives a tremendous strategic benefit from it. And he's made it very clear that he wins, whether it's in a business deal, whether it's in negotiations with Congress or with an international challenge. He believes that he gains an important strategic advantage by keeping the other side guessing, by being intentionally unpredictable or erratic. It's something that worked for him in some instances in his business career, less well in others. And you could make the case now, 103 days in, that it works in some, it's been a little bit nerve-rattling in some areas. Our European allies look very, very concerned as a result of this unpredictability. On the other hand, China has been returning coal shipments to North Korea, which makes them about as cooperative as they've ever been in being involved in this challenge. Clearly, the intricacies of international diplomacy make this kind of unpredictability or erratic behavior a much higher stakes game. But whether you happen to like Trump or dislike him, don't think of this as him simply blustering through. This is entirely intentional.
Well, let's bounce around with that. Joel, unpredictability. The madman theory of history versus we don't know what he's going to do next.
There's a fantastic column by Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, not exactly a Trump fan, and very proud of his liberal political leanings. And it was written about 3 months after the 9/11 attacks. And he said that what the United States needed to be in response to the challenge of terrorism was more unpredictable. And he said the problem that we have had for several administrations, and he didn't distinguish between Democrats and Republicans, was that we predictably withdrew every time we were faced with a threat of terror, whether it was Reagan pulling out of Lebanon or it was Clinton pulling out of the embassy countries that were hit by the embassy attacks, or initially the first 6 months of the Bush administration. We need to be more unpredictable because we don't have the military reach to fight all of these battles everywhere at once. Being unpredictable is a strategic asset. If your enemy doesn't know that whether you're going to wipe them out or simply negotiate some kind of a agreement, they might be more reluctant to act. And so if you abstract from the present political debate where it's pro-Trump or anti-Trump and just look in general as a theory of how to approach international relations, it's had its liberal proponents. Now, that doesn't mean you are unpredictable simply ad infinitum. You have to be effective in being unpredictable. So there are certain things in which it's important to be predictable. And you see that coming from places like the Pentagon. James Mattis, our Secretary of Defense, who has said that when it comes to the Iran deal, for example, he wants to enforce it very severely because it's important to be predictable, at least once we've made an agreement, to fulfill that agreement. And by the way, Trump agrees. He may say various different things about the Iran deal itself, but if you look at his autobiography, The Art of the Deal, as Dan was saying earlier, if you look at his pattern of behavior, one of the rules in The Art of the Deal is you can say whatever you want before a deal. You can be unpredictable or erratic or whatever, but once you've made an agreement, you have to follow through. Because if you don't follow through on your agreements, no one will ever take your future offers or threats seriously.
So Josh, what's wrong with unpredictable, the boring theory of history?
Well, I mean, it obviously, I think, can increase volatility in places that are incredibly sensitive to it, like East Asia, as I mentioned, where tensions are running high, and not just on the Korean Peninsula, but with the rise of China, and also in the Middle East. But I'll posit another theory, and I think Dan has a good point in looking at kind of the polls we could look at, whether you stand with President Trump or whether you find him reprehensible. The third theory being the president decides kind of what he decides based on the last thing he watched on television. And I'm not just saying that in a joking way. It really seems that he has a low attention span. He has little desire to pick up basic briefing books. We saw this with healthcare, where he seemed to exercise no awareness or judgment as far as just basic overview of policy. Same thing, I think, with the government shutdown that he threatened today. And also with foreign policy, I think we saw him come out of meetings with the Chinese president speaking a different tone, and that just leads, I think, to either, like I said, either increased volatility or people just foreign powers, both adversaries and allies alike, just discounting his rhetoric overall, saying, he doesn't mean what he's saying at all, which weakens our deterrence ultimately.
And Terry, if I can, let's pick up on this because both Joel and Josh have talked about the same thing in a slightly different way. Joel by referencing Art of the Deal in Trump's approach to negotiations, and the point that Josh was just making a moment ago. I'll posit this on Donald Trump, and it's going to sound like a criticism, but in fact it's just an observation. Donald Trump believes, at least at this point in his political career, Donald Trump believes that words don't matter. And this is not a unique situation. He believes that he can say something, and then say something else a week later, and whether that's unpredictability or volatility or whatever the word we choose, that's okay. And I want to explain, and that's not unique to him. We saw this. Governor Schwarzenegger, early in his term, learned fairly quickly that in politics, unlike in entertainment, words matter. Governor Ventura in Minnesota, almost 20 years ago, never learned that lesson. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you're a movie actor, or if you're a reality show host, you don't have an opponent. You don't have anyone holding you accountable for changing your mind and using radically different language from one week to another. And when Arnold Schwarzenegger took office, he would do that kind of thing, and a week later he'd say something else, and he was genuinely mystified that anyone got that upset about it. And to his credit, he did learn over the course of his governorship that the media covering politics, because of the adversarial nature of politics, covers what someone says in a much different way than they do in the entertainment industry. Schwarzenegger learned that lesson. Ventura never did. Trump, at this juncture, as I said earlier, clearly believes if I say something on Monday that's demonstrably not true, that's okay, because Reince Priebus or Sean Spicer or someone else will fix it on Tuesday, and then it's okay. And if I say something different on Friday than I said on Wednesday, that's okay too. That's not to say that he can't learn the lesson, as Governor Schwarzenegger did. It doesn't mean that he won't, the way Governor Ventura did. But as he adjusts from his previous career to this one, the type of thing that Josh is worrying about is not something that concerns him because his previous professional experience doesn't demand the same consistency in terms of public speaking that the current one does, and we'll learn over the next 3 3/4 years whether that's a lesson that takes or not.
I disagree with that only because I don't think this is a standard that we apply to politicians of any party. I think that Trump's teacher in learning that words don't matter would be his predecessor. I think the very concept, for example, in Syria, since we're on the topic of foreign affairs, of saying that you have a red line or saying that you've removed all the chemical weapons from Syria. I mean, those are words that didn't matter. And Trump may say one thing one day and say something the next for various reasons, but the actions were unmistakable. 59 cruise missiles, a destroyed airbase, that was clear. And by the way, when he was discussing North Korea with the Chinese president, he was attacking the Syrian airfield over, as Trump put it, a slice of chocolate cake. Now, did he actually eat the chocolate cake? I don't know. So maybe that doesn't matter. But the point is that this is something I think Obama learned from his predecessor, that the public never really...
Trump learned from his predecessor.
Right, thank you. Well, maybe Obama as well, because Bush said some things that weren't, you can go back. This is unfortunately part of politics and not just part of entertainment. But specifically with regard to human rights, which was a point mentioned earlier, and this is very important because we do have a very strong component of our foreign policy that has to do with human rights. And it is interesting to see some of the criticisms from Democrats about Duterte and about I forget who the other ones have been, whatever dictators. I don't think Trump has a natural affinity for dictators. I don't think he has a natural repulsion against dictators either. He likes whoever likes him or likes America or whatever. But I think that this newfound notion, and it is newfound, of human rights as a guiding principle in democratic policy circles is very, very new. I mean, the Obama administration was very weak on human rights. There was one country where they did fairly well, which was Burma, or Myanmar. Aside from that, it basically cast aside human rights as any kind of principle in foreign policy. And I happen to be someone who believes human rights should play a role. I think you make better choices when you go with regimes or governments that respect human rights rather than those that don't. But with regard to Duterte, for example, I mean, Duterte is sort of Trump on steroids. He really says stuff. If you want to just really be entertained and see what a Trump squared might look like, look at what Rodrigo Duterte says. But the problem we have with Duterte is we don't have a choice. We have to deal with him, and the reason is that he is currently flirting with China. And in our battle to secure the Western Pacific for freedom of the seas and democracy in general and to protect our allies, we have to keep the Philippines within the pro-American fold. And does that mean we have to excuse everything he does? No. But we have to repair that relationship, which deteriorated substantially under the previous administration. So unpredictability, again, you have to be able to wield it as a tool. You can't let it run every aspect of your foreign policy. Your allies in particular have to know that you're predictable, you're reliable. And I think that's one of the things that Trump is doing with inviting Duterte to the White House, is saying, look, I know that there are these criticisms and so forth, but we've always been your ally. We're still going to be your ally in the Western Pacific. We want you to be with us against China.
Okay, just to quickly respond, I couldn't disagree more with your assessment of President Trump there and President Obama, former President Obama. First off, if you look at President Obama's guiding foreign policy dictum, if you will, that one aide reportedly told the New York Times, it was don't do stupid stuff. And if we're to take a look at the guiding principle right now of President Trump's foreign policy, it goes along the line something of, well, I guess something should happen, which is basically what he said when he saw the video of the children in Syria being gassed. Now, granted, I supported that strike, and I supported action against the Assad regime since 2011, but the problem with Trump's dizzying, erratic, I'll say, and what you would say unpredictable foreign policy is that it's essentially putting us in the situation of potentially looking to be a paper tiger if we don't act. When President Trump one day threatens military conflict against Kim Jong-un, the next day praises him and says he'd be honored to host him. Or it backs us into a position, or not backs us, backs President Trump into a place where he then has to act militarily to horrifying consequences, in my opinion, for the safety not only of this country, but international peace and security. The last thing I'll say, Joel, is I just disagree with this notion that President Trump is some defender of human rights. I think as then candidate and now president, we have yet to find in modern American history, maybe we can look back to Andrew Jackson, of course, but modern American history, a president so disdainful of human rights and international norms. This is a person that campaigned on flouting international norms like the Geneva Convention, which senior military leaders in our country obviously want to preserve and see the merit in obviously abiding by, to, again, this almost fetishization of dictators across the globe who, birds of a feather. He seems to have a genuine affinity for who trample upon human rights, whether it's Putin, in Russia and the horrifying crimes committed there, or Duterte, who we have to deal with. Joel's right, they're an ally. But there are ways, I think, to handle that more diplomatically.
Terry, just as a couple of minutes ago, I prefaced my comments by saying it was going to sound like I was criticizing Trump, when in fact I was hopefully just trying to just offer analysis, this idea that the words, what he says doesn't matter as much to him. Josh, for just a minute I'm going to sound like I'm defending him, but I'm still trying to offer analysis. Joel makes a good point, and this is at the key of Trump's political success, and it's worth framing in both a domestic and international context. Joel's exactly right. Donald Trump is not the only major political figure in our nation's history or in modern history who says different things on different days. But the overwhelming majority of conventional politicians make some effort to explain why they're saying something different. And what Donald Trump what Donald Trump has figured out, and this has worked for him, is that the American people have become so suspicious of politicians who say one thing on Monday and another thing on Thursday and offer empty language to justify that switch. He simply doesn't bother. He says, I'll say this on Monday, and by Thursday it won't matter when I say something else, because I know that my audience is simply tired of the game that most politicians play. So while I agree with a lot of the points that Josh made, I think the one place where I would disagree, while acknowledging the danger of this approach, is I really don't believe that he believes many of the things he says. He believes, there was a famous quote years ago, some of you may remember it, from the former basketball player Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman once said, "The only bad press is an obituary." And what Rodman believed is that as long as he was attracting attention, that was good for him and good for his career. And Trump, although he doesn't put it quite so colorfully, has essentially made the same point in Art of the Deal and elsewhere. And what he learned in the media maelstrom of the New York City media market over the years of Page Six and New York One and the tabloids is it's better for him, in his mind, to attract unfavorable attention, which he can then transfer into something favorable, than to simply be ignored and try to get noticed. So he says these things, many of them, simply in order to get attention, figuring that a day or two or a week later he'll change. There are certainly stakes involved with that kind of approach in precarious international diplomacy. But honestly, I don't think he believes most of these things, and he says them because he knows they will bring him attention, not because of the sort of deeper concerns that are being articulated.
Let me move on, if I may, to the media coverage, because this is part and parcel of the whole national debate. Some of the media, particularly the media that don't like Trump, pretty much repeat everything he says to that effect, even though I tend to agree with you. I think a lot of what he says, he just puts out like firing for effect. The military have this conception of firing shells into the middle distance for effect. They don't expect to hit anything. And I think Trump is often firing for effect. But when you look at the polling, it's quite interesting. So 80% of Trump voters think the media's false stories are a problem, and just 3% think that Trump's falsehoods are a problem. Even across the population of the United States as a whole, not Trump voters, 52% of Americans think the media is basically concocting false stories all the time. It seems that if nobody believes the media, the chances of having a real conversation are drastically reduced. And I'd like you to start with that, Dan, because you have this polling expertise. What on earth has happened to our media?
The biggest challenge we face, I believe, in American politics today and in world politics, because we've seen it in Great Britain, we're seeing it in France and elsewhere around the world. Our biggest challenge is this. I love my smartphone. There are smart people who think it is an unnatural, an obsessive love, but that's a conversation for another day. But what do I love about it so much is it's empowering. I can watch whatever I want to, I can read whatever I want to, I can listen to whatever I want to, whenever I want to. I tell my students at SC about rushing home from dinner to catch your favorite television show, or punching buttons on the car radio to hear your favorite song, and I might as well be telling them about my favorite blacksmith. They have no idea what I'm talking about. The problem is that while this empowers me, my phone comes with, I can't get them out of my pocket, but trust me, I have a pair of earplugs that I use to listen to things that nobody else can listen to. Now, the problem with that is once I put those plugs in my ears, whether it's to listen to my favorite music or my favorite cable news program, I very quickly lose any interest whatsoever in what Joel is listening to and what Josh is listening to. Nick Kristof, the New York Times columnist, referred to this years ago, long before there was such a thing as social media, as the me network. The me network. Every one of us can construct an information environment that never disagrees with us, that never challenges us, that only reinforces what we believe and congratulates us for believing it. And it's human nature to want to listen to and want to read and want to hear from the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? Well, they're the people who agree with me. And maybe I find them on Fox, maybe I find them on MSNBC, maybe I find them on Breitbart, maybe it's Samantha Bee. I find that whoever I want to that can reinforce what I already believe. And that doesn't diminish the work that they're doing. But the natural human tendency is to be drawn to an informational environment in which you're the most comfortable. And when you're not constantly rewarded for believing what you believe by the so-called mainstream media, you stop trusting it. Not because it's wrong, because it simply doesn't agree with you.
Josh, I think the New York Times is doing a terrible job. And I'm a long-time reader of the New York Times. They whine as if they were a 6-year-old who just lost his lollipop. Cannot get over the fact that the election had gone the other way. Can you answer?
Yeah, well,
that?
I mean, look, there's a lot to analyze and blame the New York Times for. If we look in October 2016 and their coverage of the two campaigns, they essentially whitewashed a story on potentially the FBI's investigation into Trump-Russia collusion. And they exploded on, obviously, the renewal of the email story with Comey. So I think there's a lot of blame that we can look at toward the New York Times as just an institution. That being said, I'm an avid reader of it. I will say, and I think because Joel brought up Thomas Friedman, and the key, just going back to Dan's point, the key problem of our time, I do think, is this hyperpolarization. And one inquiry, though, that I think has been really important, and I think it really is justified, is looking at why Obama voters, two-time Obama voters went to Trump in 2016. And someone I respect a lot, who I've talked to about this, Van Jones at CNN, has done a pretty good job, I think, at exploring the motives that I think for many families did, let's not just make a blanket statement and say it was racism. There were economic grievances in certain places that propelled true Obama voters to go for Donald Trump. And I think that inquiry will help us kind of bridge the divide that Dan has been talking about.
Joel, I got to tell you, there are members of mine that said they were almost going to cancel their membership because we were going to have a representative Breitbart on the forum today. Your organization has come under intense scrutiny and criticism. Do you think you're doing a good job?
Well, that's why we're doing a good job. That's the proof we're doing a good job, that we're coming under intense scrutiny and criticism. I mean, if you're not getting intense scrutiny and criticism, you don't matter. I'll take a step back and just describe a problem I think is true of the media in general, and particularly journalists covering politics. I think there's a general lack of curiosity among journalists about what Americans think. They'll quote poll numbers, and maybe they'll give you their impressions of what Americans think, but I was a journalist on the campaign trail for a while. I covered everything that happened in California, whether it was Hillary or Bernie or Trump or Cruz. And then in the later stages of the campaign, I joined the Trump press plane and was traveling around with all the ABC, CBS, CNN, Wall Street Journal, everybody following around the Trump campaign. We had someone with Pence, and there were people following other candidates, Clinton and so forth. What amazed me is how rarely the journalists would venture into the crowd to talk to Trump supporters and ask them questions, or even to talk to protesters. And I found it fascinating to talk to people about why they were there. I found it fascinating to talk to people who didn't look like they were Trump supporters and ask them why they were there. There were, just one example, in Dayton, Ohio, which is an area I have family in, so I know it fairly well. There was a Trump rally at an arena, and there was a group of black teenagers at the back. And I said, well, I'm going to find out what their view on the candidates are. And most of them told me they had no interest in either candidate, but they were curious about what Trump had to say. They felt they were watching history and they wanted to be there to witness it, but they had disparaging things to say about both sides. It was as if they had sort of absorbed all of the negativity projected by every side and they were giving it right back. So it was interesting to talk to them. But this wasn't confined to the election, when you can say perhaps journalists have their own biases and maybe they're acting on that. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at the border in San Diego with the Secretary of Homeland Security and with the Attorney General. They were doing a press conference about sanctuary cities and border security, and the whole media was there. There were local journalists, there were cable news journalists, everybody was there. And as we walked out, back out of the border fences, back towards the road where everybody was parked, there was a group of protesters standing, maybe about a dozen people. I had no idea who they were, and I immediately assumed they were anti-Trump people. But I said, I'm going to get some quotes. I need to tell both sides of this story. So I go there, and as I get closer, I see their signs. Their signs aren't lettered particularly well, or the letters are small, so you couldn't see it from a distance, but it turns out they're pro-Trump supporters, not anti. And they were from a group of families called the Remembrance Project. You may have heard of them. Trump invited some to the State of the Union or the speech to Congress. These are people who've lost relatives to crimes committed by illegal aliens. And they were there to support the Secretary of Homeland Security and support the Attorney General. So I got a quote or two from them. But what really amazed me was that there were about 24 journalists there, and I was the only one who walked towards the protesters, and everybody else went to their cars. I'm not claiming any particular professional expertise as a journalist. It's just curiosity. Aren't you interested in what these people are going to tell you? You don't have to use it. You can just talk to them. I find there's an incredible amount of incuriosity among our media. And I think that that's one of the reasons that you're seeing better coverage on the left and on the right. In media sources that proclaim their partisan biases, ironically, they're doing better journalism. I'll give you an example. You might think someone from Breitbart might not like MSNBC, but I'll tell you that in terms of actual news coverage, going and finding out a story, the best cable news network in the election was MSNBC. I don't care much for their on-air analysts. I think they're shrill. I disagree with all the things they say. But when I would go into a crowd, I would often run into Jacob Soboroff or Chris Hayes or somebody senior from the network who was talking to ordinary people. You didn't see that at Fox. You didn't see it at CNN. You saw it almost nowhere. But MSNBC, which is avowedly left, and Breitbart, which is right, these are the outlets interested and showing some curiosity, not just in their own supporters. I saw MSNBC journalists at Republican caucus votes in Nevada and things like that. So I think that there needs to be more of that kind of curiosity among journalists. Journalists are too interested in what they say about each other, the sort of Washington, New York, to some extent LA bubble, and not as interested in what people in the rest of the country are saying.
Terry, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead, and I want to pick up on that.
Joel used a phrase that I want to come back to, and it alludes to a point that Josh made also. He used the phrase, these people. And Josh and Van Jones defined these people, not entirely, but a certain degree of Venn diagram overlap, as any number of voters who supported Obama once or twice in the past, or did not vote in the last couple of elections, who turned out in very large numbers for Trump. And I think if you want to understand Trump's instincts on foreign policy, it's worth us spending a couple minutes talking about these people. And I'll offer you just a couple of observations and we can go on with it or take on other topics. From the very beginning of Trump's campaign, there was a very specific demographic cohort that represented the foundation of his support. And I will tell you that demographic cohort is one with which I have a great deal in common. Number one, that cohort was overwhelmingly white. Number two, that demographic was overwhelmingly male. Number three, that demographic was overwhelmingly, well, the phrase I prefer to use is of a certain age. My students say old, but I'll be grading their papers next week, so it'll all come back around. But there's one demographic characteristic I'm leaving out that I don't share with most of those voters. his demographic core of support was white working class men. And the term working class, as all of you know, has become a very polite euphemism in 21st century America for didn't go to college. I have a great deal of difficulty, and I won't go into much detail about it, difficulty explaining to really smart young college students not why some people can't go to college. They know that some people lack the economic means, that their families need them to work, that they tragically didn't get the education they deserved that would qualify them for college. They understand that. They don't understand why somebody would choose not to go to college. And for generations of these white working class men who chose not to go to college because there were reliable, well-paying jobs for them in factories and on assembly lines and on construction sites, I don't know that they're the angry voter that we hear about. I'd argue instead that they're the frightened voter. And so I have skepticism when either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders talks about withdrawing from the rest of the world. But I'm a 53-year-old college professor. If I'm a 53-year-old factory worker or a 53-year-old former factory worker whose plant is shut down, I respond in an entirely different way. And when that 53-year-old former factory worker, unlike the 53-year-old professor, hears the phrase, "Make America Great Again," he doesn't think the things that many of us might about reversal of hard-fought and necessary victories for women and for minorities and for friends in same-sex relationships. That man thinks again means getting a job again, opening the factory again, getting his self-respect again, if only we stop with all this trade and all this immigration and all these things in which the rest of the world encroaches on us. Trump knows this intuitively. Steve Bannon, I'd suggest, is his muse who helps him articulate this. But if you want to understand, I think, how Trump approaches the rest of the world is that he's very, very aware that his core base of support is frightened. And he, to his credit, unlike most candidates in both parties, has been talking to them whether I happen to agree with those solutions or not.
Josh, isn't it the case to this point that the word that will be most associated with Hillary Clinton in history is the deplorables?
No, I don't think that's going to be the word most associated with Hillary Clinton. But look, can I quickly respond to Dan's point? I think it's an excellent point. And I think just to discuss this a bit further, these voters, if Trump is kind of their id or is manifesting their hopes, aspirations, and fears, Trump is essentially seemingly swinging between two poles, one of this paleo-nationalism or Pat Buchanan isolationism, and one of hyper-hawkishness, mother of all bombs dropped on Afghanistan, a strike on Syria, potentially even more involvement in that conflict, and the Korean Peninsula, as we talked about. So I think it's a very interesting inquiry, and I think that segment of the electorate, the white working class, that potentially could swing between these two poles, is something that we should obviously study further to try to understand this phenomenon, because I do think, and as Joel mentioned, I think MSNBC did do an incredible job with regard to its journalism and its coverage throughout the campaign, and we need more kind of intrepid journalism to uncover this phenomenon. Sorry, just back to your question. I do not think Hillary Clinton will be associated with the word deplorables. I think, it was really interesting today because Sean Spicer finally got kicked off the air, and it was Hillary Clinton that kicked him off. And it was kind of it speaks to that enduring Hillary mania, or love her or hate her, this kind of fascination with Hillary Clinton that's existed for some 3 decades in America. And she I think gave a pretty good summary today of why she lost in 2016. I think she spoke about obviously the Comey letter and the interference by Vladimir Putin in our election, but took full credit for it. So I think I think history will be much kinder to Hillary Clinton, especially. We've only been through the first 100 days of Trump. It's it makes me think of that George W. Bush billboard, "Miss me yet?" We're missing you. It's like when Will Ferrell came out at the not White House Correspondents' Dinner and was cheered as George W. Bush. But in any case, I think history will be much kinder to Hillary.
Well, the reason I say it is that the elite completely scorned Brexit. They completely scorned Trump. and they're in the process of scorning Le Pen. And I'm not saying Le Pen will win, but you're seeing the same process repeating itself, where an elite, Hillary Clinton talks about she won the popular vote. Subtract LA County and New York City, and she lost the popular vote. So that's the margin. And you can draw a line from Florida to Idaho, and you won't pass through a single blue county. So it seems to me that even if the word itself is provocative, it expresses an attitude that not only, I think, cost the election, but also is something that hasn't been even begun to be addressed. I talked about the New York Times and its whining. I mean, where are the New York Times reporters in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania? You know what I mean? It seems that they still haven't got the message. There's a large block of American voters, stroke British voters in Brexit, stroke French voters, who don't like the consensus that globalization is good and we can all live in this wonderful world and get rich.
Well, yeah, I would love to hear what Dan has to say about this, but what's wrong with Kansas? That's an inquiry we've constantly done. And in looking at why conservative voters in the so-called red states vote against their economic self-interest. And I think, Hillary was criticized, obviously, for that comment. It was probably an inappropriate, choice of words. But we have to remember that, when then candidate Obama kind of made an observation, basically, about rural voters and saying they cling to their guns. He was heavily criticized, but he was kind of, from almost an academic perspective, trying to make a comment on how I think some voters fall prey, unfortunately, to disinformation campaigns, ones that have been waged effectively here at home and ones that have been waged abroad. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Let's talk about the disinformation campaign from abroad. What was with the Russians? Dan?
Can't we first hear what Joel thinks the word is that Hillary Clinton's going to be remembered for?
That's too easy.
Monica? No, the deplorable comment was important. I don't know if it was a turning point, but I think, just to add to what Dan said earlier about these workers, the most striking polling failure in the entire election wasn't the general election failure. And by the way, fantastic job at USC and LA Times. I mean, they really, not only did they poll well, but they stood up to intense criticism. But the biggest failure was the Michigan Democratic primary. The Michigan Democratic primary was supposed to be Hillary Clinton's. She was up in the Real Clear Politics average by 20% going into the primary, and Bernie Sanders won. How did that happen? Nate Silver called it the biggest disaster in polling history, potentially. And one of the interesting things in the exit polls was they asked both Democrats and Republicans what they thought about trade in Michigan. Now, if you look at the economic statistics, Michigan, I think, is the fourth best state in terms of benefits from trade. So Michigan's actually doing very well from free trade. NAFTA has opened up cross-border trade with Canada, cross-border manufacturing, according to people who like free trade. So these are perhaps biased sources, but they're statistics nonetheless you can use. 1.1 million jobs in Michigan depend on trade. And yet when they asked Democrats and Republicans, does trade help or hurt American jobs? 53 to 55% of both Democrats and Republicans who showed up to vote said that it hurt American jobs, and only 31 to 34% said that trade was good for American jobs. That doesn't mean that trade is bad for American jobs. It just means that the voters who were angriest about trade showed up to vote. And those were Bernie Sanders voters in the Michigan Democratic primary, and they were Donald Trump voters in the general election.
Terry, can I talk to this for a second before we go on to
I want
Russia?
to hear about Putin.
I'm sorry?
I want to hear about Putin.
Before we get to Putin, very quickly, I just want to follow up on a point that we heard from Joel and from Josh, and maybe it's something that I can quantify to some degree from our polling experience last year. So for 8 years, USC and the LA Times partnered on a California political and policy survey, candidates, ballot initiatives, issues, and so on. And I'm proud that we were the most accurate poll over those 8 years in the state of California. Last year, a very, very smart colleague of mine from an entity on campus called the Center for Economic and Social Research. The Center for Economic and Social Research, which actually has the best acronym in higher education, CSER. They came to me with a proposal to take a poll that they had done in 2012 with a dramatically different methodology than we'd been using and that all major pollsters had been using, and wanted us to work with them in the 2016 campaign. The difference was this. Most public opinion polls, CNN, Fox, New York Times, and ours for many years, polls voter preference. Do you prefer candidate A or candidate B? Do you prefer Smith or Jones or Trump or Clinton or Joel or Josh? And people give their answers. What the smart people at CSER did instead is they put together a survey that polled not voter preference, A or B, but rather voter intensity. On a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you of your vote for your preferred candidate? And on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you that you're going to vote? And what we found will surprise no one in this room whatsoever, because it's become conventional wisdom, accurate conventional wisdom. But we have the data to back it up, which is, as you know, there are more people in this country who supported Hillary Clinton for president than supported Donald Trump. But the people who supported Donald Trump were much more certain, much more fervent, and therefore much more motivated to turn out, particularly those white working class men who had not bothered to turn out to vote for Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush. And Hillary Clinton supporters, most notably young people and voters from minority communities, people who would not have voted for Donald Trump if you had put a gun to their head and a knife to their throat, simply didn't bother to turn out and vote. And so the lack of intensity, the lack of motivation, is ultimately what steered us to where we go. And real quick, and this will bridge us to Putin, Trump understands this. I don't know whether he understands it consciously or just intuitively, but he understands. And if you look at his behavior from the election to Inauguration Day, and from Inauguration Day to day 103, he has not expanded his base of support one single iota. And the reason for that, I'd suggest, is he hasn't tried. He has made no effort whatsoever to talk to voters who did not support him on Election Day. And instead of trying to expand his base, as most conventional politicians of both parties do, he's instead been working as hard as he possibly can, not to expand his base, but to motivate his base. And the way he motivates his base is by talking about immigration, by talking about trade, and by talking about the kind of role that the US plays on the world stage.
Okay, so Putin, Russian hacking. Joel, Trump is very sensitive on this. Is there something he's hiding?
The real crime that the Russians committed was not to hack our elections, but to prove that the Democrats were hacking their own election. I mean, the initial batch of DNC emails that came out showed a degree of collusion between the officials in the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign, which is why many of them resigned after the convention. Now we've just learned from the New York Times, which sometimes does a good job, we've learned that the FBI uncovered through their monitoring of Russian hackers a memo that was sent by some Democratic operative saying that they were confident Loretta Lynch would quash the Clinton investigation. And the Times reported that that was most likely what motivated James Comey to come out when he did on October 28th and say he was reopening the investigation, was that there was a sense that Loretta Lynch was fixing the investigation to preserve Hillary Clinton's chances of winning. That came out earlier through the strange meeting on the tarmac in Phoenix with Bill Clinton aboard a plane and so forth. But the Russians did hack. They tried to hack both parties. They tried to interfere. Their interference is constant. It's still going on. The Chinese also hacked. By the way, the Chinese hacked the Office of Personnel Management under Obama, and you didn't see a big media circus about it. One of the personnel records they got was mine, because my wife has security clearance, and so anyone who went through security clearance had to submit all kinds of information about their friends, family, colleagues, and so forth. And so I got a letter from the Office of Personnel Management telling me my personal information had been compromised and was probably in the hands of the Chinese government. Now, that was a big problem for me, but it wasn't a big problem for the media. But anyway, the Russians hacked, and they did so deliberately. I don't think they ever had any thought that Trump would actually win the election, because if they would, you would have seen Russian oligarchs cleaning up on the foreign betting exchanges where you can predict on the outcome of the election. The Russian election in the Russian intervention in foreign elections is real, and you can look at the European parties that they've supported. They are much more directly involved. They have much closer ties to Europe, trade and otherwise, but also there are finance rules that they're able to exploit. And that doesn't happen here. So I think the Russian hacking story is mostly a red herring. I do think, though, that Democrats are desperate to blame them for the election, not only because it's such a surprise win for Trump, but also because of what the Russians released. The Russians released information that the Democrats were rigging the primary against Bernie Sanders and were trying to rig the investigation against Hillary Clinton. And that's unforgivable.
Josh.
Well, I don't think it's a red herring. I think it's going to bring down Trump's presidency. At the very least, cripple his presidency. At the worst, be fatal. And the reason being, I mean, if we look at this investigation, which predates obviously him taking office, 4 congressional committees investigating, an active federal investigation with at least 4 to 5 different agencies, FBI, Department of Treasury, CIA, and others, since last summer. The resignation of National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and obviously the recusal of our Attorney General, Sessions, with regard to this investigation, and countless other, inflection points we can look at. I believe that there is fire to this smoke, and that in the coming weeks, the American public is going to learn some damning information about both associates of then-candidate Trump that colluded with either the Russian government or Russian intelligence, and possibly the president himself either knowing it or covering it up. Watergate took almost 2 years to unfold, and there were many people that were indicted and sent to prison. So I think we were obviously, an anxious public. And, if you watch MSNBC, you get excited, obviously, anticipating that there'll be some revelation that day. But I think in the next, I'd say, 5 to 6 months, we're going to see some really damning stuff come out that will, again, I think, put the Republican Party in a place where they're going to have to choose to be the party of treason or the party that represents the country.
Dan, I don't know whether or not there was any collusion with the campaign. I guess that's what these investigations are for.
If you did, I wish you had not been holding it till now.
But I am, as an American, I'm personally outraged that an autocrat who's more famous for shutting down his own political system should interfere with our democratic system, and that our political world is not up in arms, starting with the president. If he's got nothing to hide, why isn't he criticizing the Russian involvement, whether or not it's got anything to do with him? I mean, it seems to me this is a scandal.
Well, there's some bipartisan blame to go around on this, because you're right. On one hand, if it is only smoke and not fire, then it would be helpful for all of us for the president to be more forthcoming in the way that you talked about. To be fair, though, not to steal one of Joel's points, is the Obama administration has been widely reported, made a very conscious decision not to heighten voter concern over this hacking last fall, because they were concerned they would be perceived as trying to sway the outcome of the election. So when 2 consecutive presidents decide to downplay this, it's not surprising that there's a relative lack of public outrage. Look, Josh might be right. It may turn out that behind all this smoke there is fire, and we will have an unconstitutional crisis that results in the impeachment and the resignation of the President of the United States. It is entirely possible that it is just smoke and not fire, and because we have a President of the United States who, along with his other qualities, becomes increasingly stubborn and increasingly digs in when he feels cornered, that because he does not follow the conventional political playbook and disclose information, when back into this kind of corner, like I said, it might turn out to be smoke and not fire. You don't know. I have made, for the last 22 months, I have not made a single correct prediction about Donald Trump. I have no intention of breaking that streak tonight.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Tom McClintock from our great state, Republican, made a statement that was initially ballyhooed. He said that President Trump's first 100 days were immensely successful, and he'd signed more bills than any other president in the first 100 days of his presidency. And the immediate reaction was guffaws. PolitiFact checked it out. Turns out it's right. He'd actually signed 28 bills, which is more than anyone since President Truman. The question, however, remains, have they really changed our nation? Are they significant? And what about all those things that have got away, starting with affordable health care?
So first off, I think by and large, the majority of these executive orders are inconsequential. The ones that are consequential, we've heard a lot of outcry at. I think President Trump's first 100 days are really marked by that first weekend when the Muslim ban was unfolded, and we saw, this was obviously unconstitutional and against the spirit of civil rights, equal protection, establishment clause, et cetera. And we saw a wave of protests sweep the country. And on that same note, Terry, it's widely reported now that on Thursday, for National Prayer Breakfast Day, President Trump is going to sign an executive order, the so-called religious liberty proposal, executive order that Vice President Pence has been pushing, which essentially would be an assault on the LGBT community, and I think will produce the same type of outcry, if it is to be manifested, as the Muslim ban did, because the LGBT community will feel tremendously assaulted by an order that essentially legalizes discrimination against them. So again, McClintock might be right, but there are two major executive orders there that are pretty consequential.
Joel, are you disappointed with the first 100 days achievements?
No, not at all. But look, as a conservative, I never judge presidents by how many laws they sign, because I don't think most of the laws are that helpful. A lot of the things Congress passes are burdensome and expensive, and I'm not impressed with those numbers. What I am impressed with is what they did with 13 of those laws. There's a hitherto obscure law called the Congressional Review Act, which was passed by Bill Clinton, actually signed by Bill Clinton when he was running for re-election in 1996. It allows Congress to repeal regulations. And as long as those regulations are within a 60-day window, once they're reported to Congress, Congress can wipe them off the books, and they stay off the books until Congress passes a new law enabling those regulations. The idea of the law was to prevent lame duck presidents from from promulgating all kinds of regulations and so forth, so that the incoming Congress could undo that. What Obama did, and either through neglect or contempt for Congress, was he failed to report a lot of his regulations, which meant that the 60-day window never began. And so what Congress has spent a lot of the first 100 days of Trump's administration doing is going back over the Obama regulations they don't like over the previous year and just wiping them off the books. And it has been tremendously effective. From a conservative point of view, it's thrilling, actually, because nobody has taken a hatchet to the administrative state the way that President Trump has. It's probably the most conservative thing, other than appointing Neil Gorsuch, that he's done over the first 100 days. And there are people on the left who understand what this means, but it's mostly been ignored by the media because they're focusing on tweets and they're focusing on the drama of who's up, who's down in the White House, Russian conspiracy theories, all sorts of things. But those in the media who understand Trump's not going to disappear tomorrow and he's not going to be impeached or fly away on a broomstick, and he's here and he's governing and these decisions have some permanence, are worried on the left about what he's doing with these Congressional Review Acts. But what he's, aside from just cutting down the administrative state, he's using these using these pieces of legislation to target interest groups. So the coal miners are very happy with a regulation he overturned about water and certain standards they had for downstream pollutants. He got rid of the ban on lead ammunition in national parks. Lead, the word lead is very scary, but it turns out it's not really that big a problem. It was just something Obama did. And the NRA is thrilled. I mean, it's a big Second Amendment achievement. So he's going through, picking interest group after interest group and giving them what they want legislatively. He hasn't done the big ticket items yet. He hasn't done tax reform. He hasn't done Obamacare. That's going to be very difficult. But in terms of his legislative record, I would look at I guess it's about half of what he's done. Some of the other bills are the bills every president does, renaming a post office or something like that. But those 13 bills are very, very important.
Yeah, I'd say lead almost wiped out the California condor, so not really with him on that.
Okay. So Terry, we began this conversation by parsing the distinction between unpredictable and erratic. And I think with two really, really smart and perceptive people, we've come back pretty much full circle. There are a lot of very astute observers who will argue that Trump's first 103 days have been an abject failure. His travel ban has been held up by the courts, his health care reform is a shambles, and there's an extraordinary number of unfilled positions in government. There's a lot of other really astute political observers, including that base that we talked about earlier, who would say these first 103 days have been a remarkable success. The rate of undocumented immigrants coming to this country is at the lowest level it has been in many, many decades. The president has demanded that the leaders of Mexico and Canada renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, and there's an extraordinary number of unfilled government positions. So once again, according to conventional according to conventional political assessment and public opinion polling, he is the least popular president in modern American history. On the flip side, 98% of those individuals who voted for him in November said that they would still vote for him if he were on the ballot today. So once again, I think the one thing we can agree on is what we have is the most polarizing political figure that we've seen in this country in many, many years.
Since Obama, you mean?
And whether you think that's a good or a bad thing depends on where you sit in our community or on our stage.
Now we have 2 microphones, one in each aisle. We can try and reach in a little bit, but if you're in the middle, if you could kind of try and make your way out to ask questions, we'd appreciate it.
And raise your hand, please.
And come up to either Alexander or Christian. Thank you. Okay, Alexander, you can go first. Thank you.
How can it be called the Muslim ban when it's not a ban on on immigration from all Muslim countries? Isn't that a willful distortion, not to say a lie?
Let's take that.
Well, the reason being is because then candidate Trump called for a Muslim ban, and his own statements have been used by that court on that island, as Attorney General Sessions has said, in U.S. District Court in Hawaii, to uphold a restraining order against what is deemed harmful to the interests of states and their residents, and also potentially unconstitutional. So the language of Muslim ban comes from then candidate Trump and President Trump himself. And his own words are now being used against him, essentially, to prevent the passage of something that I find reprehensible morally and also, I think, legally completely unconstitutional.
Can I respond to that? When Trump first talked about a Muslim ban, I think it was November 2015, right after the Bataclan massacre in Paris, I wrote an article about it, and I said, this is a bad idea, this is bad policy, but it's not unconstitutional. And it's still not unconstitutional if you were to call it a Muslim ban, which it isn't, but the president, first of all, has virtually untrammeled powers in terms of designating who can come into the country and who can't. And the free exercise clause does not apply to people who are not Americans and who are outside of the country. You can argue there are some cases where maybe there's an American who has a relative overseas. Okay, then you get into the constitutional question. But in general, the president's saying, I'm not going to ban people. And by the way, we use religion as a criterion in immigration all the time. We've used it to usher people into the country. We've used it to keep people out of the country. Effectively, there's a Muslim ban already in place because you can't bring your polygamous spouses into the country. There's actually questions on immigration forms. If you are practicing polygamy, as many people do in Muslim societies, you have to choose one spouse and one only to bring over. That, you could argue, discriminates against Muslims. Well, it's the way it is. The courts have referred to that rhetoric, and it's sort of extraordinary to see courts do this, and I think that's one of the reasons these rulings won't hold up. First of all, it's extraordinary that they would intervene in an area where the president has such statutory authority, which is pretty much total. But secondly, the idea of using campaign statements to determine intent over and above statutory authority is really odd, and I don't think that'll stand up, because then you can look back. Barack Obama said in the Democratic primary in 2008 he wasn't going to use an individual mandate to run his healthcare reform, and lo and behold, he gets into office and he does it. Well, imagine if that had been the grounds on which the Supreme Court decided the Obamacare case. They could have said, you said you weren't going to do this. We can't allow that into our courts, and I think that's going to fade.
Hi, good evening. This is probably for Joel. Who is Steve Bannon? And can you just give us a little bit of information about him and allay some of the fears that he's, this mass murderer guy? And also, does he survive the administration?
Steve Bannon was the executive chairman of Breitbart News, and I worked alongside him for roughly 5 years, very closely on a day-to-day basis. And I can say that he is a tough guy. He is a very driven person. He has an amazing strategic view that allows him to look past whatever the current crisis happens to be and see the long-term goal. He is a Navy veteran, Harvard Business School graduate, all these things. And I think that he has contempt for the media, which is why he, in a way, revels in the notoriety. He appeared, the first profile of him that was ever done was done a couple years ago by Bloomberg News Weekly. They had some magazine, and they called him the most dangerous political operative in Washington. And he posed for a cover shot there, and he was sitting on a couch wearing shorts. And I was horrified by the shorts. And I said to Steve, "What's with the shorts?" And he had done it deliberately in a way to kind of send them up a little bit. You know, he likes tweaking the media a little bit. And he's very passionate about things he believes in. And I used to argue with him all the time. You know, not always the easiest bedside manner, as we used to say. I used to argue with him. But if you can bring facts to the table, he will listen to any point of view. And I think that the media have done to him what they do to every successful conservative, which is they turn you into a racist, Attila the Hun. You know, it's part of the routine. And he has, I think, perhaps recklessly in some ways, invited the media to do that. He called himself Darth Vader, you know, in one interview. I mean, he's joking with them, and to those of us who understand that, it's obvious. But I can allay the fears by saying simply this. When Steve became executive chairman of Breitbart, we had just lost our founder, Andrew Breitbart. The company was trying to find its way forward. We had just restarted as a 24-hour news organization, and he helped guide us through that crisis. I was editor-in-chief at the time, and today we are one of the biggest news sites in America, not just conservative sites, but we're in the top 20 somewhere, and we have 40 million unique visitors, 200 to 300 million page views a month, and that's the goal Steve saw. And that's why I'm very comfortable with having someone like that in the White House advising the president, because I'm familiar with his argumentative nature, but I'm also familiar with his calm demeanor in a crisis. And it makes me feel better about having someone like that, no matter what their political ideology, advising the president. I didn't like Rahm Emanuel, by the way, and I'm from Chicago, and I really don't like his policies and so forth. And he had a temperament people complained about. But I think Obama did better with Rahm Emanuel in the White House than he did after he left, because Emanuel understood strategically how to win. And I think Obama's troubles began when Emanuel was less in favor, because Obama wasn't broadening his base, he started narrowing it. I think Steve stays for the simple reason that he is viewed by the people who voted for Trump as their emissary in the White House. He is the person who stands for the policies that Trump emphasized to win the nomination and then to win the election. So I think he sticks around.
Dan?
I think that last point is the most important one. I'm not burdened with the actual knowledge because I've never met the man, but it is in the pundit's Bill of Rights that we get to opine on things whether we have actual knowledge or not. So I'm going to follow up on Joel's last point, because I'm going to talk not about him as an individual, but rather what I perceive to be his impact in the administration. I mentioned this earlier briefly. My assessment is that Steve Bannon is Donald Trump's muse. Now, think about Trump. Think about his history. Donald Trump is an outer-borough Queens guy, albeit a very, very wealthy one, who came to Manhattan with a chip on his shoulder against who he perceived to be the Manhattan elites. And that's been him from the very beginning. And long before he began talking in public about running for public office, the voters we've been talking about earlier in New York City, the cab drivers, the construction workers, these are the individuals who Trump considered his people. And as a New York builder and as a frequent guest on the Howard Stern show, he knew exactly how to motivate that base in support of his goals. When he entered politics, he obviously has a good sense of who these voters are and what interests them. But I think Trump was savvy enough to understand that Steve Bannon was not just the emissary of his core base of support, but probably the one person in his circle who really did have a good and deep understanding of who these voters were and what was important to them. And as we go forward, one of two things is going to happen. Either Donald Trump is going to gain confidence. No, really. Either Donald Trump is going to gain confidence that he has decided that he no longer needs help to divine the wishes and the preference of these voters, in which point Bannon becomes less necessary to him. Or, as we've already seen, at least in terms of public perception, Bannon is not being fired. He's not being thrown out onto Pennsylvania Avenue. but it appears that his voice has become one of many in the administration as opposed to playing the more dominant role than it played in the campaign.
Let's get the next one up here, thanks.
How do you think late night television like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver has affected Trump's presidency?
Good question. Well, I mean, thank God the writers aren't going on strike, so we can have as many jokes as possible against this president. Trump was probably praying for a writer's strike. I think late night TV has seen a renaissance, a boom, if you will. Everybody is raving about SNL, and the caricatures become larger than life. It kind of reminds me of the 08 campaign and Tina Fey on Sarah Palin when you see Melissa McCarthy on Spicy and obviously Alec Baldwin on Trump. But I think it does get into the head of Trump, and he clearly is disturbed enough about it to tweet every so often against SNL and Jimmy Kimmel and things like that. So I think for us or whoever is not enjoying the Trump era, it's kind of a calming, fun thing, if you will. Also,
Please.
First, thank you guys for being here. I do think we would have had a little bit better overview on the first 100 days. There's a little bit more diversity up there, maybe some gender-wise, race-wise, but that has nothing to do with my
Could you
question.
slow down and just give us a question?
I was wondering, I want to know about what you guys think about Trump's economic policies. And of course, like in the past, we've seen similar ones. I'm thinking Reaganomics, which created a huge deficit. And I'm wondering how you guys think this similar tax plan will be different and how it could have different outcomes.
The tax bill? Okay. Tax. Let's go about tax.
I don't know that this is traditional Republican orthodoxy. Keep in mind, as we keep going back to this core base of Trump voters, they voted for him because they like tax cuts, but they also voted for him because he promised not to do anything to change Social Security and Medicare. That's not traditional Republican orthodoxy. He avowed a much more confrontational approach to trade. That's not traditional Republican policy. And what's most interesting, I saw a public opinion poll somewhere last week, not ours, so I don't really care whose it was. I saw a public opinion poll somewhere last week that suggested, interestingly, that these working class, $40,000 to $70,000 a year voters, were the most enthused voting group for the Trump economic package. And for many, many years, for decades, Republican thinkers have believed that cutting taxes for many voters is an aspirational thing. In other words, I might not be wealthy enough to benefit from this yet, but I hope to be, so that's going to be a good thing for me. And so in some ways, there is certainly some traditional Republican orthodoxy, but if he were simply recycling Ronald Reagan's tax cuts, I don't think he would have been elected president, and I don't think this voting cohort that we've talked about would still be so strongly supporting him.
Please.
My question was, I'm kind of a centrist for the most part, but I have a lot of problems with regards to the difficulty with the wall. If our laws are such that we want to keep out illegal immigrants, why the general consensus is so against that, insofar as otherwise change our laws and let everybody come over our border. Now, that might not be the best way, but there's such a outcry against it.
Why not have a wall?
Well, no, because I think there's a bipartisan consensus among the American people and in Congress that there should be sensible immigration reform, and that we don't need drastic measures, whether it be the creation of a wall that will cost billions and billions of dollars that we are going to pay for, not Mexico, or just horrific raids and detention policies that target even legal residents. So I think there's a bipartisan consensus in this country, and I think Trump's in the minority on this issue.
Gee, if there's a bipartisan consensus, they're sure hiding it real well.
And
it's not so.
Do you guys want to add to that, or we can go to the
I
next?
mean, the Republicans.
I'll just add one more quick factoid. Once again, resorting to public opinion polling, the majority of Donald Trump's voters last November did not believe that he was actually going to construct a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border. And once again, they were okay with that because once again, he was listening to them, he was paying attention to their concerns, and even if he wasn't able to actually achieve the goals that he articulated, the fact that he was listening and responding was good enough for them.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions, one for the entire panel and one also for Joel. For the entire panel, how do the three of you think, or feel, I should say, about the prominent generals who are advisors to the president? The Secretary of Defense, Mattis, Secretary of Homeland Security, Kelly, also the National Security Affairs Advisor. And the reason I ask that, my dad, who's
Just keep to the question, please, because our time is a bit limited.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My dad feels very comfortable with these generals surrounding the president because he thinks they might prevent him from making a foolish decision in our dealings with a possible adversary. And my question for Joel specifically, how do you justify your working for Breitbart? The reason I ask that, Breitbart has been painted, and the common perception, or the perception among some people, is that Breitbart exposes, if you will, fascist-type views.
Okay, Joe, go first.
That's easy. I feel fine working there because it doesn't. And in fact, it takes on those views quite vehemently. And I mean, speaking in regard to issues that I follow, particularly in the Jewish community, there's been no news website that's been more aggressive in documenting anti-Semitism on campuses than Breitbart News has. So I feel comfortable working there despite what people say, because what people say isn't true. And our readers know that, and I think the many journalists who've tried to figure out our coverage and who've sat through it for a week or so have agreed.
On the generals, either of you others want to weigh in on the generals surrounding Trump?
Yeah, no, I think I have a tremendous amount of respect for Defense Secretary Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster. I sleep better at night knowing that I think they are kind of running the show, I think Steve Bannon has been sidelined on foreign policy, and I think the wing of the generals has been lifted up. I think that's a good thing for foreign policy, regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican. Thanks.
Next question there. We have just time for one more from each side, I'm sorry, because we're kind of running out of time. You go ahead, Yaman.
Okay, so the majority, or a huge majority of the federal tax budget is going towards national defense, and a tiny minority is going towards the EPA and environmental protection and everything like that. And the general reason for this that I've kind of picked up from Trump is that they can't ask people to pay for environmental protection, when in fact environmental protection is potentially the biggest threat to our future as a civilization. It's a huge health hazard. And what I was wondering is, how would relabeling climate change or global warming as an actual real hazard to our future generations and everyone?
Climate change. You want to talk about climate change? Who wants to talk about climate change?
Well, no, I think it's possibly the greatest threat to international peace and security. Obviously, it's a man-made challenge, and I think this administration has set on a horrific approach. I think they want to gut agencies that are obviously trying to enact some standards, and there is some regulatory framework that they want to remove and try to disrupt and cause some chaos. I will say this though, as Joel mentioned the Iran deal, and while Trump has railed against it as a candidate, seems like his administration will continue on with it and just monitor it severely. I have a feeling that they will face tremendous pressure as well with the Paris climate change deal, that in the end he may not pull out of the Paris climate change treaty because the consequences would be too grave. China is already becoming a climate change leader into itself, and I think that would be truly embarrassing to Trump to see himself one up by the Chinese president.
And Terry, if I can just offer this quick thought, for those of you who read the news coverage of the agreement that Trump and Congress made just in the last couple of days to keep the government open and avoiding a government shutdown, it's worth noting that agreement provided for roughly half of the increase in the military budget that Trump had asked for, and avoided virtually all of the reductions that he had proposed in environmental protection. So regardless of whether you think those are good or bad things, I'll make the same point today that I did on election night, which is we have a system of checks and balances and separation of powers for a reason, and it's for different factions and different groups and different individuals to negotiate out their differences. I understand your concern. I happen to look at both climate change and violent terrorism as significant threats, and I'm not smart enough to rank them. But while this conversation is obviously focused primarily on the president, a question like yours is an excellent reminder for us that he is one player in a brilliantly arranged system.
Can I respond to that? The climate science is one thing, but the climate policy is absolutely terrible, and I'm glad he's throwing most of it out. I hope he throws all of it out. Most of the climate policy we've undertaken has been a dramatic failure, has hurt our economy, and is also a national security threat in itself, because our Navy is now under pressure to use green fuels in naval vessels, which cost $26 a gallon and don't do very much when you run out of them. Climate policy is predicated on an alarmist hypothesis which exaggerates incredibly both the impact of climate change and what we as one nation can do about it. The one thing I think that solves climate problems, if you take all the science, you accept the consensus, is technological innovation. And that's one of the reasons for the last decade the United States has been able to grow its economy while reducing emissions, and that's because we're switching to cleaner fuels. So to the extent the administration is doing that, I think it's a very good thing. I think that many conservatives are anxious that he hasn't pulled out of the Paris Agreement quickly enough. It's not a treaty, by the way, because if they ever tried to put it through the Senate, it would be rejected. And I think they're now working on, he said on Saturday, in the next 2 weeks, they're going to do something about Paris. And I think that, again, that's one of the reasons that he was voted in, because people are tired of being told the sky is falling. There are some serious possibilities in climate change that I think we as a society need to grapple with and deal with potential impacts. But when you're constantly being told things that are demonstrably untrue and then being told that it's science, people tend to be skeptical about it, especially when it hurts their jobs. I mean, most of the damage from rising sea levels, for example, would hurt coastal property. That might be a very great concern to those of us who own coastal property, but is it worth wiping out thousands of communities in Appalachia to protect the wealthy real estate? I don't know, but that's ultimately the question that's how the question felt to Trump voters.
You have the last question.
I have two questions. What dangers will the next generation, which is my generation, the millennials, what will we face with Trump and his ideas on certain things such as science and everything? And then also, why should people that are suffering in the economy right now, why should they trust someone that basically doesn't really have faith in them?
Well, I think the main challenge that the next generation will face with Trump, and it's something that I think the Trump administration has scoffed at, is automation. But it's something that it's not that Trump is causing, but it's just a generations-long challenge, because we talk about a few thousand coal mining jobs in Appalachia. There are millions of jobs possibly that could be replaced, and not just in the United States, but across the world, that could be replaced by artificial intelligence. So that, I think, is one of the most enduring challenges in the future, and it's one, I think the Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, recently said, oh, well, that's not going to happen for another few decades, and that's frankly not true.
Can I answer that question in a slightly different way? And this comes back to a point.
Bet on it.
Yeah, that Terry made about media. I mean, I actually agree with what was said about automation. I think it is a question, especially when students are studying things that don't necessarily allow them to switch careers very easily. But I think the biggest problem is the granular disintegration of American social discourse. And what's happening, when you pointed out your smartphone, I was going to add to that, but I didn't want to take up too much time. But we're not just media consumers, we're media producers. And we are all producing things on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram for our friends and family and so forth. We're not interacting with each other in forums like this. I mean, this is fantastic. That's why it's so nice to be here and why we're all happy to be here. But George Orwell wrote in the 30s that it was amazing that all the innovations of the early 20th century that connected people, like the dirigible and the telegraph, or I suppose that's 19th century, but all of these things that were enabling people to connect to each other ended up dividing them. And the same is true today. We have the means to understand our fellow Americans through Facebook and social media and whatever, but we end up circling the wagons around our own point of view. There are very few people who venture outwards to discover alternative points of view. Now, that's not just a political problem. It's a relationship problem. You're seeing, the joke is about Thanksgiving dinner, arguing with your uncle or whatever, but this is not just confined to Thanksgiving anymore. You take it with you everywhere you go. And siblings aren't talking to each other. Marriages are troubled in some cases. I mean, we're seeing on a level, I don't know if it's measured by opinion polling yet, but we're seeing, I think, a disintegration of the kind of ordinary conversations people used to have. And I think for millennials in particular, it's a huge challenge because millennials get their news from social media, from late night comedy, which is also very segmented. Liberals watch it, conservatives don't. And we're reaching a stage where we're going to have a generation that is tasked with the huge challenge of governing this country for the next generation that comes after them, and who are not used to speaking with each other. And it's a real problem. So I'm really glad that forums like this exist, but I think that's a big challenge for millennials.
I'm gonna guess by your question, sir, that you were not pleased with the outcome of the election in November. And so I'm gonna direct my answer to your question not at you, but toward the less admirable members of your generation. The thing that you have the greatest thing to fear about is your generation's very selective type of political involvement. I've had the good fortune of spending the last 20 years in the classroom, so I've learned over those years not to call it apathy, but it's a very selective, very particular type of political involvement, because I'm guessing what you know intuitively and what I can show statistically is that your generation votes in smaller numbers than any generation in America today or in recent American history. Now, to give you credit where it is due, your generation also volunteers your time back in your communities at greater levels than any other generation within memory. And the message that I try year after year to articulate to my students, and I hope that you will pass on to your friends, is that while volunteering is admirable and volunteering is noble, voting is necessary. And you can't afford to do just one or the other. If your generation had turned out to vote in similar numbers as older generations, Bernie Sanders would have been the Democratic nominee for president. And had your generation awakened after the close of the primary and voted in similar numbers to the rest of the elected in the general election, Hillary Clinton would be the president of the United States. You're attending a program like this, which shows to your credit that you stand above and apart from less engaged members of your generation. But the greatest thing that you have to fear is, despite your best efforts, your generational colleagues deciding that volunteering is wonderful, but that voting is for old people.
Well, these are lofty and inspiring thoughts. I am sure that everyone in the audience has their own political views, and I don't know if we change any views tonight. That wasn't the point. The point was just to open some windows. I hope you enjoyed our program. I thank Joel, Dan, and Josh for talking tonight, and thank you all for coming.